Hi listeners, welcome back to Cybereason's Malicious Life. I'm L0pht. This is part 2 of our interview with L0pht, the 19s hacking crew that basically invented responsible reporting of bugs and told the Senate they could take down the United States' entire internet, among other things. If you haven't yet, check out part 1 of the discussion or go to our YouTube channel where the video version is already live. And now, let's jump right back into Nate Nilsson's conversation with L0pht members John Lester, Count Zero, Chris Weissappel, Weld-Pond, Joe Grand, Kingpin, Christian Rio, Dildog, and Chris Thomas, Space Rogue. Same as in the previous episode, I'll be jumping in once in a while to provide some context where needed. Enjoy.
It comes through why this place was kind of cool and why you guys were joining up. But like, what motivated you guys to get together so much, to do this work, to interact with these companies? Like, what was the reason to stick around and spend so much time with this stuff?
It was fun.
Yeah, it was fun. I mean, that's an important question though, because that happened later on in the progression of the L0pht, right? So like Weld was looking at vulnerabilities in 93, but it wasn't probably till 95, and especially when Dildog came on, when getting the publicity of the vulnerabilities and sharing that information and trying to change people's view of coordinated disclosure or all of that stuff was a much later on thing. But it started just like the original L0pht started as this curiosity, and it was fun. And that's how it just progressed as the kind of industry or as technology progressed at the same time. So it wasn't a conscious decision all of a sudden to be like, let's do this. It was fun, right? And you got
I think it was L0phtCrack, I think was the demarcation point. Because Dill, I think you came on after L0phtCrack, right?
Just briefly after, I was helping to write the sort of next generation of L0phtCrack code base. Because it started off as just an open source thing, and then there was a Windows port that we did a lot.
Right, because we did the open source command line thing and we gave it away. Yeah. And then we realized that companies were making money off our free code. We're like, well, wait a minute. If people are running audits using L0phtCrack for free, like maybe we should charge companies $50 or whatever. And I think L0phtCrack really was the demarcation for us to go from, this is a fun hobby play around thing, and we're releasing info and making the world better. But after L0phtCrack, we're like, okay, we can do all that stuff from before and make, some money.
Also, I've done a lot of work over the years before L0pht and since then with developing communities of people in different ways, shapes, and forms around technology, around education. And the real seed that carried on, I think, through the whole time of the L0pht was this sense of being pioneers. And that is a very unique atmosphere. In the initial days of being a hacker, you were a pioneer, meaning that, there's no Google the answer. There's being a pioneer means you're not only in a new space, but you are relying on other people to help you navigate and understand this new space, new information space, new physical environment, new virtual environment. And what happened was in those early days, people forget that, you had to rely on people and social networks and connections to understand what was going on and to discover and make. And then when you made innovations, you then shared those innovations with other people. And the evolution of that going from an open sharing to then communities change over time, but the core DNA stays the same. And then this pioneering community then turned into a business model. Now we're going to apply those same pioneering attitudes to business. We're going to, but it all comes down to, I think, the fact that it was a pioneering time. It was so unique in that there was such limited accessibility to information. I was going through my old pictures, putting up different ones here. Here are the old Vaxes outside in the loading dock in the old L0pht. But we used to, just manuals. I have a bunch of pictures of Brian Oblivion and myself filling U-Hauls full of manuals because you couldn't access them any other way. There were no, go online and look for it. Go Google it. So I think that's
no, I totally agree, John. But I also think part of it was we were pioneering and we had access to resources that other people didn't have because Boston we had a lot of high tech companies, but even more importantly, we had MIT and Harvard. Right. And these are places that themselves were researching this stuff. So the stuff that they were throwing away, we were able to, harvest that and be able to repurpose it and whatever. So it was both like an attitude, but also there was like fertile land for us to sort of dumpster dive in.
Exactly.
I like that fertile land. That's what it is. It's like pioneers out in the fertile landscape.
You go for the Oregon Trail, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, I'm not sure I would have been able to do what I did if I hadn't been at MIT at the time and already on. My fraternity house had a whole class B of internet space allocated to it. So I learned about routing. I learned about IP networking and all this stuff just by being there. And then when I realized that 2600 meetings were happening and that the L0pht, who I had seen the website of the L0pht at MIT, I was like, doing in the Athena cluster, doing my homework. And I just perused around, and back then you could probably browse the whole internet if you wanted to, and the whole web. And I found the L0pht homepage. I was just like, oh, these guys are doing some pretty cool stuff. And I just thought nothing of it. On my own was just like, dinking around with Windows 95 when it came out and realized I could crash Internet Explorer. I was like, okay, actually, this is interesting. I can make this do something. And it was after that, it was like around 1995, 96, that I realized that, oh, wait a minute, these guys are actually just in my backyard. Like I could probably go find the L0pht folks if I wanted to. But this 2600 meeting would be a pretty cool thing to go and to meet other people doing this kind of stuff. So I printed out my exploits, had them on a piece of paper, and went to 2600. And sure as hell, it was like Barton Oblivion and Voice Opal and Space Rogue and Mudge, and everybody was just there, just hanging out, going to get beers and stuff after. It was just like, all right, that was awfully convenient, and we had a lot to talk about. So
yeah, we used to go to MIT after the 2600 meeting to the Athena clusters and play. What was it, NetTrek?
Yeah,
we would go to Athena clusters early on Sunday mornings while we waited in line at the Flea.
Yeah. And you'd log in as root with Mr. Root, right?
Mr. Root.
It was the same password everywhere.
Getting those machines by accident.
So that was internet access before we even had internet at the L0pht. We would go to MIT to do that.
In the early days, each of the guys threw in some money for the rent, electricity, and other expenses of running the L0pht. They even shared the space for a while with a hat-making business run by Count Zero and Brian Oblivion's wives. They tinkered with what they already had lying around or could find dumpster diving. But things change, of course. By the end of the 90s, many of the L0pht hackers had quit their day jobs, incorporating under the name L0pht Heavy Industries. They've done some white hat hacking for some of the world's biggest companies, whether those companies asked for it or not. They testified before the Senate, were featured in a New York Times Magazine profile, and even an MTV show called True Life. They'd also moved into a nicer space, the new L0pht.
I think it's important to note, though, too, because we kind of jumped from the early to sort of later. There is this transition period in the L0pht that a lot of people don't really talk about, right? And because we had some press coverage, community coverage back in the early days with Annalisa Savage's Unauthorized Access, which is an amazing documentary that really shows that hacker community spirit, the hacker ethos of the original L0pht. That's an amazing thing to see. And then you jump to the later time where, we were on a lot of these larger media outlets trying to share what we're doing. But a lot of it was because of vulnerabilities in research and showing what hackers, can do. But there was a real transition between, I would say, this kind of grassroots, scary, dirty warehouse kind of area into moving to Watertown, into a different spot with more of a goal at that point of let's see if we can, have a nicer space and sell some, stuff to survive and see if we can do this, eventually see if we can do this full time. So there was a conscious transition also. There's some of the work we were doing was this normal, natural transition, but the physical movement of the L0pht was another demarcation point that a lot of times we don't talk about, right? And it's I personally like Count Zero was at the old loft. He was not at the new loft. And that was a major shift in how the loft was operating, really.
Well, we also lost other people in the shift, like Golgo. I think White Knight was moving, but Golgo stopped. He didn't come to the new loft either.
That's right. And White Knight, I remember always starting fights with him in the little parking area loading dock of the loft, even though he was like way older and would always kind of beat me up. But it was like, it was a major shift, and there were lots of reasons that happened. But being a young kid, I just sort of went along with it. But that's a transition spot. I'm sure Zero has something to say about it, of like, not to put him on the spot, but it's like there was that time where we said, okay, our lease is up, let's move to somewhere different, right? And like that, it wasn't all rosy all the time.
There's always going to be communities change, they evolve, they shift, people come and go. And it was definitely a different perspective. At the time, like I wasn't interested in stuff as a business, and so, that was that. In retrospect, I'm a lot older now, and I've seen a lot of other things come and go and grow and evolve. And I've been involved in different startups that come and go, grow, evolve, acquire, and all that stuff. And it's the same story. It's always the same story. It's just that there are different. The trick is just understanding where you are in the story, because it is a story that changes over time. Any healthy community will evolve and change like that over time. So it was in retrospect, I think it's the whole story is beautiful, but it is a narrative with like in any other narrative where you have characters come and go and people were critical at one moment and then at another moment they didn't have a role anymore because the story had changed.
That's a good point, Joe, because the fact that we had such major transitions and more than one of them at any point along that, as John calls it, the story, that we could have ceased to exist. Like it could have fallen apart. We all went our separate ways. The transition to Watertown is one of those transitions. The transitions to a business is another one of those transitions. And there's probably a couple other ones if we sat down and analyzed it. So the fact that we were able to keep it together for 8-9 years it was, and then the end game was totally the end game. But I think the fact that it lasted as long as it did is pretty amazing.
I love that explanation. It's a story, right? And communities change and things are sort of evolving as the world is turning and evolving and everything. Did you feel that way at the time? Because that was sort of, you had helped start the community. Yeah. that was your baby, right? And like, it was such a spot where looking back, it's like, oh, it's a narrative of the story. But for me, I still feel guilty.
No. At the time I was kind of freaking out too. I guess I didn't understand what was happening. I just wanted things to stay the way they were growing in my mind. Right. I hadn't, I was working at Mass General. I was focused on my career in neurology, and I wasn't thinking, I was like, I'm not really interested in, it's funny. Like if I went back in time, like now I'd be like, yeah, let's do this business. Here's a business model. Let's do this. This is kind of fun. I'm into that now. At the time I was just like, kind of, clueless about that. And it was just because we're all different people at different points in time in our lives. And at that time, I was just not the right person. I fully accept it now. Back then, at the time, I was just like, whoa, this is messed up, man. What's going on? I was confused more than anything else. I was more confused than I was mad at anyone. And, but, the perspective of time and me having seen how things play out in other systems and my own career path and businesses that I've been involved in, it's like, wow, it's history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And it's like, yeah, this is the rhyme.
What does it take to end cyber attacks? At Cyber Reason, we can tell you exactly what it takes. It takes an army of battle-tested defenders on a mission. Defenders who fight the foes that operate under the cover of digital darkness. Defenders who think, move, and adapt faster than cyber attackers. Defenders with the technology and effortless automation to spot an attack forming on computers, mobile devices, servers, and the cloud, and alert you when it matters most. To end cyber attacks, it takes the brightest minds in global cyber intelligence working to deliver future-ready protection to guard your data wherever the fight moves. Cybereason is ready to win the battle with you and for you. In the fight to end cyber attacks, we are the defenders. Cybereason. End cyber attacks from endpoints to everywhere.
So if it really was this sort of old L0pht, new L0pht, these transitions as you guys became more mature and a little bit more official and you start to get attention, in what ways did those years affect you? Like through your 8 or 9 seasons of this sitcom, how did you change from Joe, you getting arrested and being this like 16-year-old kid, to the people that you guys became when you left? Were you now like full professionals? How did you change during those years?
I have to say that my mindset now is exactly the same as it was back at the L0pht. And I'm still not as young, but I'm still the same punk hacker kid. I just happen to be able to do what I love to do. But the mindset never changed. And other people have had different transitions, right? Like Count Zero said, the story, everybody's perspective is different and everybody's place in their life at that time was different. But besides all of the early days of, kind of learning and kind of mimicking what all these guys were doing, the later years taught me a lot about loyalty and how not to run business and how, support of friends should come first. So a lot more of life lessons than technical lessons that I still struggle with and I still remember all the time. And every time I do something in my life, it's like, all right, I've had that experience and that didn't turn out well because we didn't talk about it. Or I'm not going to start another business with friends because I didn't like how it ended. And there's a reason why I work almost exclusively independently, except with very few people that I trust, right? So it's a lot of the personal issues that, because it was these formative years of all of the experiences, both good and bad, like were major shifts. I would not be the same person if it wasn't for joining the L0pht at first, right? And all of those things. But everybody has a different perspective.
Well, for myself, I was a software developer when I came to the L0pht, and then 5 years later, I decided to transition into becoming a cybersecurity professional, and I got my first job doing that, like 97 or so, 98. And I think the same thing happened with Mudge. Mudge was a programmer, and then around that, maybe a little bit earlier than that, he decided to do that. So I don't think I'd be in security today if it wasn't for the L0pht, because there was a huge, it was like, to some degree, it was more important than my career to be part of the L0pht, right? It's like interesting, like a lot of people, their hobby is more important than their day job. But certainly in this case, that was that, and that really influenced my career afterwards.
But you said that you turned into doing security even back then, right? It was a much smaller group. Like Dill said, there was one guy working security at Microsoft.com. So getting into a security career, I think was part of the L0pht helping create that, or helping raise awareness of
that's true. The L0pht almost created the security career as we know it for a lot of people.
We crashed through a lot of walls. We forced the hand of the industry a bit by, pulling their pants down on a regular basis. Something had to fill that space. We filled a large quantity of it. Corporations, other companies, people that wanted to do what we were doing, filled that space as we forced it open. Making a market has been a thing. Being the tip of the spear for InfoSec has been an interesting challenge. We started off with the L0pht doing advisories. We then, ended up doing ad stake with the consulting thing, legitimizing the careers of a lot of people that would otherwise have done that kind of work anyway, but maybe illegitimately. And then, with Opal and myself, we founded Veracode and proceeded to, automate application security analysis and, trying to take the things that people were doing by hand and automating them so they would scale. So that's sort of a natural progression, is that sort of defining the need, meeting the need, but then scaling as the need grows. That's sort of a pretty standard sort of way of building an industry is, when you identify that a need exists, you figure out how to meet the need, but then as that need becomes, as people realize they can depend on it, as people realize that security is important and that it's actually something they can leverage, in order to grow online businesses and things like that. If every online business failed because of hackers, there wouldn't be any online businesses. So as this industry grew up around the security thing as being something that needed to happen, the work we were doing became more and more important over time. It's unclear whether or not we created the problem and then created the solution or not. I kind of laugh at that and giggle myself to sleep about it every night. But it's more like we were there when the problem was the thing and noted that, hey, as a hacker, you find how to break things, but you also might catch a glimpse of how to prevent yourself from being able to do that thing. How would I fix this problem? And that's almost just as tangibly interesting. You can break something, but then you can if you can find a way to automate or make it easy to raise the bar on your own attack, suddenly, you're contributing to the public good. And, I always wanted to do that, and I'm, these days, I'm still automating application security, and application security analysis is my job. My private projects are more in the realm of privacy and social media and stuff. I'm not going to get into what those are, but I've got some nascent ideas on how to improve online communication and, moving in the general direction of identifying problems and trying to find better technologies and ways of solving those problems for people. And, I think that everyone at the L0pht has done that in some way through their careers. I don't know if it's changed us personally, like I know it did for me. I know my goals are far more less. It used to be a much more shiny thing is in front of me. I'm just going to play with it. And now it's more mission oriented. Like I have some goals to improve privacy online. I have some goals to automate application security, and I'm moving more toward goal oriented than I am like the sort of, dealing with the shiny thing in front of me and just playing with whatever's in front of me. So maybe I've changed a little bit in my, how I've, where my drivers are personally, but how I go about doing what I do is basically the same.
7 days after Y2K, an unexpected kind of partnership was announced. L0pht Heavy Industries was merging with @Stake, an internet security startup with $10 million in backing and some big tech executives behind it. Media outlets noted that it was odd to have guys named Count Zero, Kingpin, and Dildog join up with a very mainstream kind of company. But in retrospect, it was revealing, a signal that hacking wasn't just for the kids anymore. By joining @Stake, the L0pht was basically over. Its members went on to take security jobs at other companies like Symantec, which acquired @Stake 4 years later.
I think also with that transition of like turning the L0pht more into a business, there was still the underlying, we're still part of the hacker community. We would still have our parties. I fondly remember going to the L0pht on weekends and just hacking on stuff for no reason, just like back in the day. And Space Rogue was there always too, and he would also drive me home.
Every day.
So there was still that love of technology and that love of hacking and that passion still traveled through this whole story, right? It's just the business side started to make a little more sense of like, hey, let's do this. And like, all the guys had full-time jobs that they quit when we started @Stake. Actually, I had my first full-time job. I had been an engineer for a year in a product development company. But for me, it was easy because I was still young. And it's like, sure, quit the job and try and see what happens. But I think Weld already had a family, and it was a pretty significant kind of shift to try to start a company. But there was always that underlying love. And I think that started to probably die for people, myself definitely, when we were at @Stake and sort of saw the realities of the larger picture. And it wasn't just hacking for fun anymore. It was like, oh, the venture capitalists want to make a profit.
Yeah, but before we got to the VC, like the goal was just to make enough money so that we didn't have to pay rent, right? And then it was okay. So we paid our rent. Now let's make enough money so we can pay ourselves, so we can just hack all the time, right? And then it became, oh well, we're going to go VC. So it was like stages. Like it wasn't just like, okay, let's go make $1 million. Let's start small and pay rent.
Yeah, that's a good point. And do the security analysis for what like the assessments for CTP and some other places that, yeah, I mean, it was starting to make that transition, but as it got more serious, the fun started getting sucked out of it, I think. So, right? As with any business, right?
I think there was another part that it was separate from the business. That was, we were kind of, because we were so well known and open, and, you know, we became sort of a crossover between the hacker community and the business community, between the hacker community and the government. And of course, the Senate testimony was the biggest crossover of that. But because we were open and outspoken, we would have people from, you know, academia, you know, Marcus Raynham, who can make the claim to be the inventor of the firewall, I think, would come over, and certainly the inventor of the IDS. Would come and want to learn from us and interact with us. And there was a little bit of a love-hate relationship. He didn't really like hackers, but he was really intrigued by what we were doing. And the government was really intrigued by what we were doing. So I think that, you know, separate from the thread of us getting more business-like over the years, just becoming more open to interacting with government and just other businesses, not to make money, just to educate. Was a big part of that, you know, sort of second phase of the L0pht before At Stake.
I have a great printout from Gweeds, which was another local hacker from back in the day. It was like L0pht sells out, blah, blah, blah. Space Stroke shaking his head. It's, you know, but it was a time, like Weld said, you know, we testified in front of the Senate. We were kind of dancing with the government a little bit. Not as like rats, and not in that form, but as far as educating them about hackers, at the same time dancing in the business world and then still dancing in the hacker world. Nobody had done that successfully, right? And it was something that was so new, and it pissed off a lot of people. And Gweeds' article from the hacker side is the hacker perspective of like sellouts, blah, blah, blah. So it was really an interesting time. And then from the academia side, it was like, oh, these guys, you know, how can you even trust them? They're not even using their real names. So we kind of got hate from all these different sides, but there was still this sort of respect or curiosity about what we were doing and trying something new. So it was the love-hate kind of thing. And there was a lot of pressure too, I felt at that point, of you had this reputation of what the L0pht was, that was maybe bigger than what we were, or something like that. And it,
well, we tried to do that, right?
Well, we tried to, but then it almost went a little too over the top, because we loved the press.
We managed the press. We managed.
We loved the press, but that was important to share that message. But it became a bigger. We had a bigger reputation than I think maybe.
And I think that's partly what saved us. Like, we earned a lot of goodwill in the early years in the hacker community and other areas and other communities. And so when we did finally go to the business route, and we did start getting some of that, disgruntled sour grapes put at us, the fact that we had built up the reputation and goodwill amongst the various communities, I think helped us a lot, because it could have gone a lot worse. And we were afraid of that at the time. We were really afraid of being labeled the big sellouts by a large majority of the community. And we did get that to a little bit, but I don't think it was anywhere near as bad as we thought it was going to be.
And it actually opened the floodgates, right? Because after the L0pht sold to At Stake, then it was like a bunch of other security consulting companies started coming with a lot of other hackers that were in the community. So we sort of got the brunt of it. It's like, you know, when a garage band has their first major label, but then after that, it sort of shows, heavy metal.
Yeah.
It's now.
Rap guys can get, major label deals now.
Yeah, I mean, the security industry exploded in 2000, if you remember. I have a talk that I give. I have a slide of the NASCAR shot of all the logos of all the companies that started in 2000. And there's like almost 24 companies that were founded between 1999 and 2000. And you have to wonder, where did all these security companies come from? Who are these security experts? Like, they didn't exist in 1998. And suddenly in 2000, you have 24 companies being security experts because they were all hackers. Right? Nobody admitted it, but they all got VC and they all started their own companies. I could name half a dozen. It was Foundstone, right? Garden, At Stake. Anyway, there's a bunch more. ISS, right? Got eventually bought by. Anyway, where did all those companies come from? They were all hackers, right? And they all got their VC, and they all whatever happened to them after that. But it was 2000 and the Y2K fear, and some of that money bled over into security industry.
There's another interesting point about that. It's post L0pht, but I think worth mentioning as far as that transition of hackerdom to more well-known, security stuff is when we had started At Stake, one of the big primary motivators is like, the executives were like, yeah, hell yeah, we're hiring hackers. We're going to tell all of our clients, yeah, we use hackers because they understand the technology, blah, blah, blah. Really proud of it, right? And
that was before the executives showed up, right? After the real executives came, that all ended.
Yeah, it was very early on. And it was like, we had shirts. It was like At Stake, and on the back, hacker, right? Because when we sold the L0pht to start At Stake, it was very important for us to try and maintain what we were doing of this vendor independence, vendor neutral. If we find a vulnerability, we want to release it. If we're doing security research, we want to do it regardless of who our customers are. And the early executives were very much into that. But then, as the board got bigger or whatever, more less security executives came in, or people from that world. They're like, wait a second, no, hackers are bad. So like, our entire career of trying to, or 8-year career of trying to share this hacker message of like, no, not all hackers are bad, totally went down the toilet. And then they totally switched their tune and would never even mention that we were hackers. So you did have this, where all the people came from, I don't know. There were some from the community, but there were a lot that just all of a sudden became experts. And at the same time, it's like trying to sort of, change history and rewrite history. But hackers are important, and they were then, and they'll continue to be important. And whether they're on the bad side or the good side, it's keeping everybody going. And it is kind of a cat and mouse game these days, but to try to pretend that you're not a hacker or that you don't have that mindset is to me sort of ridiculous.
These days, the L0pht crew is most often associated with their Senate testimony. But that's just the most famous example of a much broader legacy, of being the guys who 30 whole years ago were trying to tell us those same things we're still arguing about now. The internet isn't secure. Companies aren't secure. It doesn't take more than a few smart hackers to do a lot of damage. They tried to warn Microsoft, the United States government. Yet even today, we see major organizations falling victim to the same kinds of threats L0pht was dealing with in their day.
Well, guys, we've already been speaking for over an hour. So I suppose I'll only ask one more last question to get any last thoughts out there. In our world today, the world of the MS Exchange hack that looks so much different than what you guys were doing back then, you look back, what is the legacy of what you guys were able to achieve? In what ways did you influence the world that we now have today? And if L0pht were still around, if you guys were all working in, the one L0pht together, what would you be doing with all of your collective brains?
I'd be running the L0pht Foundation, the nonprofit segment of the L0pht Heavy Industries, which would be involved in educational outreach.
We should do that. That's amazing.
L0pht Foundation.
That's a deep question. I think the legacy is maybe just showing what a group of like-minded, passionate individuals can do. But I think it's also it also shows, at least the early days, that you can do things and explore and be curious and just live life without this ulterior motive of trying to be successful or trying to make money or however other ways you define it. Of course, that's easier said when you're young, but you can do great things without always trying to worry about being famous, being rich, being whatever, right? Being social media influencer, all this stuff. I get a lot of emails of people saying, oh, how do I, become a hacker? And it's always like, well, if you're asking that question, then you probably won't be because you can teach the technical stuff, but you can't really teach the mindset. Though I try a lot of times. But the Loft just was at this perfect time in the world and in technology, and it was just an amazing spot that maybe not exactly could be replicated, but you've seen sort of hacker spaces build off that, and communities build, and maker spaces and other more public spaces kind of grow on that. So I think it just shows the power of community if people are passionate and work together.
I think it's at the frontier. It's about the frontiers too. It's the legacy is the importance of the right types of hacker mentalities around frontiers. Frontiers always exist. We always think that we've conquered them all. I study history a lot, history of technology adoption. People always assume, yeah, we've conquered all these frontiers. Like for example, one frontier I've been involved in since the L0pht passed was the whole blockchain Bitcoin space, which didn't exist pre-2010, right? And there's always frontiers, and the trick is to find the people with the hacker mentalities who are involved in the frontiers. And I think the story of the L0pht is a perfect example of how that technology frontier and community could grow.
Both John and Joe, you both mentioned like hacker mentality, and that's a big part of my current job is because I run our internship program here at IBM at X-Force Red, and I'm constantly looking at resumes and interviewing students who are going through cybersecurity degree programs at prestigious universities, which totally did not exist, when we were around. And a lot of these kids are really bright and they have a lot of technical knowledge, but I have to weed through, 1,000 resumes and look for those students who have that hacker mindset, because that's what we're looking to hire and run them through our program. And I think it's a big part. I like to think of the legacy is that we're trying to promote and forward hackers, right? And people who are generally curious about technology and how to make it do stuff that it wasn't designed to do. So that was what we were doing at the L0pht, right? We were just trying to bend tech into our will. And so, and you're right, Joe, you can teach the tech stuff. I can teach you whatever you need to know tech-wise. I cannot teach you how to think. And that's what I need people who know how to think like the hackers.
And it was
lucky to have you.
Right?
They're lucky to have you as the internship leader.
So for me, I think part of the legacy is like challenging your environment, like challenging the world. Like, don't take everything as face value as dictated by the government or by academia or by corporations, because we blew all that away, right? Like we didn't take any of that stuff at face value. We're like, what does it actually do? How can I manipulate it? How can I change things by educating people about something in a different way? So I think for me, a lot of it is, challenging the status quo, and don't be afraid to, do some research and then educate the world.
Yeah. And that's more important now probably than ever, right? It's like, you really have to question and think on your own and try and not necessarily trust, but prove, right? Trust, but verify, and all of these things. That is sort of that same mindset. And it's, if people can look back and be like, oh, the L0pht did that, like maybe I can try to do something like that. But I think that's a great point.
Yeah. The thing that stuck with me was the fact that the kinds of, I guess you could call it intellectual property, but the information that we generated at the L0pht, things we discovered, that stuff was powerful. The key to activism is knowing that the information that you have is powerful and that you can change things with just a little bit of the right information. I see a trend over the various years, over the last 10, 20 years toward online activism and hacktivism, and people leveraging hacking skills to make an asymmetric playing field to tilt things toward their particular aims, and you could affect some very good change in the world and shine light in dark places that need it with a very little bit of information and a little bit of skill. And the L0pht did that early on. Companies were brushing these huge bugs and vulnerabilities under the rug for their own gain because sure as heck was easier to ignore them than to fix them. But it was just a little vulnerability, text file or an exploit that was able to shift the direction of some of these large companies. The same thing is happening now with countries and political parties and organizations that affect public policy, and huge companies that are social media giants, have these horrendous privacy practices, and it's the little actions of hackers, which are actually minuscule, honestly, that are having the biggest effect on making public good policy changes that actually happen out there. I've gotten a real bent lately for online activism and dealing with communities that are extremely toxic, and how can hackers help? The thing that is important to remember when you have all these sort of built up hacking skills that you've worked on over the years is that they're not useful unless you do something. Do something with your skills. Change the world. Make an impact. It can be through a very little thing. You can change the world through a keyhole if you're doing it right. And that's very much what I learned at the L0pht was that it didn't take a lot to make a big effect. And I hope that other hackers and other people with a position with where they can take that little bit of leverage and make good things happen in the world, that they take the opportunity.
That's it for this episode. Thanks for listening. Next week's B-side episode will be an interview I did 2 years ago with Chris Weissapel, aka Wellpond, about his experiences during the At Stake days, and in particular about the now famous Senate hearing. In all honesty, I was pleasantly surprised by our listeners' reactions to the L0pht episode. Judging by the number of comments and shares on Twitter, it's obvious that many of you remember L0pht fondly and appreciate their work in the 90s. For example, AP wrote, quote, "Excellent nostalgic foray into trailblazing scene, hacker space culture, blazed by legends." JG added, quote, "You gotta love a bit of L0pht. My heroes of the time, and helped to bring the perils of ignoring security to life in a few boardrooms, as well as getting some people out of deep holes. L0pht crack. Oh yeah, that's the good stuff." End quote. Spyphone 2010, who says he or she is a government coder and reverse engineer for the NSA, reminisced on L0pht's special CD that was full of good stuff, and user Evid from Boston, who is apparently into old tech and vintage computers, actually uploaded a picture of the said CD. And lastly, Count Zero himself, John Lester in real life, added a few pictures of the L0pht space itself. This is so cool. I mean, it was just like I always imagined a hackerspace would look like. So, thanks to all of our listeners who participated in the Twitter threads about the episode, and you're all welcome, of course, to join the conversation at Malicious Life or follow me at @RanLevy. That's RANLEVI. Our website is malicious.life, where you'll find, as always, full transcripts of almost all of our episodes. Cybereason's Malicious Life is produced by PI Media. Our senior producer is Nate Nelson, with sound design by Beno Habari. I'll use the opportunity to remind you that we at PI Media also create special audio documentaries called Family Sounds, for families who wish to preserve their family's history and legacy. So if you've got a parent or grandparent who celebrates an important birthday, Family Sounds might be the gift you were looking for. Check us out at familysounds.co. Thanks to Cybereason for underwriting the podcast. Learn more at cybereason.com. Bye-bye.
TK Music.